place where we've got a lot of problems. ISIS, the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, over to Ambassador Ziadeh.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me clearly? It's okay? No.
Pull it closer.
Oh, my God. How about now? Okay, I'm going to sit on the edge of my chair. It's going to be so riveting. Okay.
They're all moving out, too.
ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. You've heard about it in the news. Al-Qaeda, 9/11. It evokes very, very emotional meaning for us as Americans. And for myself, sitting in the State Department that day and looking out my window and watching the Pentagon get hit that day and watching the fireball go up in the air and then wondering, oh my God, what the hell just happened? These are times that we don't forget as Americans when we have suffered greatly from those who would do us harm. ISIS evolved in the region, in the Middle East, originally in Iraq. And I can talk about that, but let's just go back for 1 second. What are our national security interests in the region? I'm just going to tick them right off the list. Number one, of course, counterterrorism, strength through our allies in combating terrorism that can do our harm to us and threatens our allies around the world. Number two, the availability and unimpeded flow of oil and natural gas from the major countries in the Middle East region and actually from Africa as well. Three, of course, the protection of a key ally, Israel, in the region. And in addition to that, our support for other countries that are allies to us, many of them in the Gulf, Jordan, most of them are well known to us. And then fourth, an area which has historically been part of our national security interests and that we have promoted, but perhaps not as much in the recent administration, is democracy and human rights. Now, if we look at the issue of ISIS, ISIS arose in Iraq, really a manifestation of ungoverned spaces in Iraq in the aftermath of the Iraqi invasion of 2003, the disintegration of Iraq as a country, the breakdown of civil society, dismantlement of the army, dismantlement of the civilian government, de-Baathification, and really no role for the Sunnis who had dominated in Iraq for at least the past, say, 100 years. With the development of nation states starting to take place again in Iraq, but the Sunnis not finding their place, the Al-Qaeda in Iraq morphed into ISIS. And ISIS, by its ideology, decided that not only they were going to be the Islamic Caliphate, they were going to be the Islamic Caliphate that had territory on the ground, tangible. And so they started spreading and conquering land in Iraq, going, moving east and north, taking up parts of Mosul, Anbar province, the north up towards Kurdistan, and actually making their way within about 50 miles of Baghdad. It was extraordinary in 2014 watching them move like a wildfire through Iraq. We, as the United States, along with coalition of our allies, worked very hard in beating back to fight ISIS, also in coordination with the Iraqi army that did a lot of the fighting. We worked in this regard to beat back ISIS, taking back Mosul about a year ago, and then moving into Syria, because as they were being defeated into Iraq, they were crossing the border into Syria. Syria, an area which had been basically ungoverned space and falling apart as a result of the rebellions against Bashar al-Assad, the son. and the northern part and eastern part of Syria being pretty much in control of ISIS. So it was a tall order. The military campaign started under the Obama administration and continued full throttle with our allies under the Trump administration until October of last year, when ISIS was effectively defeated in their capital in Raqqa, Syria. Now, there are still pockets of ISIS still in Syria, particularly in the south and in the eastern part, but I would say about 85–90% has been defeated, which is an important achievement by the forces, the U.S. forces that were advising Syrian forces on the ground, Kurdish forces, Syrian Kurdish forces, and in cooperation with our allies. So what has that meant? It has meant that today we look at an area in Syria and in Iraq that basically had to come back together as a community. Now, in Iraq, it was a bit easier because you had a strong central government, relatively so. You had an area in the north, which was the Kurdish areas that were relatively stable and prosperous. And you had an Iraqi army that was able to move in. And as they say, when you conquer an area, you want to hold it, and then you want to build it. And the Iraqi army, together with Iraqi civilian government and local control, were able to do it. And you're starting to see life return back to Mosul and these areas that have been liberated from ISIS. Now, Syria is a different situation, because in Syria you have these ungoverned spaces that really have been demolished, and you have a central government under Bashar al-Assad that has basically been at war with his own people for the last 5 years, since 2011. If we look at Syria, there have been estimated 500,000 people who've been killed, and a good half of the population has been displaced, either internally or externally to neighboring countries like Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. So the idea of just being able to pick up the pieces in an area that is a large area that actually oversees about 7 million people in population is no small feat. And so our concern now is this. We have defeated ISIS in Syria as a state, as an entity on the ground. But we have not defeated the ideology that gave rise to ISIS. And this is part of our challenge now. When I say our, I mean the international community, not simply the United States. How can we create the conditions there whereby we can create stability with civilian authority, we can restore electricity and water, and we can have beginning of economic development and plow and seed land for agriculture, so that the people in the region can return back to this area and take control through local councils and local civilian control, whereby they can protect the area and return their families. This is the stability we're looking for. We're also looking to have that stability because what we don't want is to have Bashar al-Assad take over and commence warfare against his people. So we don't want ISIS returning, and we don't want Bashar al-Assad to take over and continue his warfare against the local population. So we, as a country, have to think about what are our interests. We have about 2,000 military on the ground there in that area. They have been providing support to the fighters who've been there, and it has been quite successful. And I think the thought for this administration is, all right, we took a position that was a principled position by the attacks in the last 2 days against the chemical production facilities in Syria, because the use of chemical weapons is prohibited, and this could not stand without a response from the United States. And it was the right stand, and I applaud not only President Trump, but his whole national security apparatus, which he brought together and made an informed decision about how to proceed. And as my colleague Marcy said, and the use of our allies, the French and the British, with their military force, to be able to show that this is not simply an American reaction, this is an international reaction, and we have partners. But the question becomes, where do we go from here? What are we willing to commit, whether in treasure or in people on military on the ground, to be able to secure an area to make sure that ISIS doesn't return? Because ISIS will not only take over territorially and subjugate the people that it conquers, it will begin plotting and has begun plotting against us. So the question becomes then, how do we proceed forward? And this is the issue that the Trump administration will continue to grapple with. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, we do this other full-time.